Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and this is part 2 of Your First Quilt with men's dress shirts. So we're going to start off our pin basting with our backing of our quilt flat on the floor, right side down. I'm using a sheet that I picked up from the thrift store, and so it doesn't matter which side I use. But if you are using a printed fabric or a fabric with a right side, like the pretty side versus the wrong side, you want to put the pretty side down. This is going to be the back of your quilt. And what we're making today is called a quilt sandwich, which is like every other thing in quilting. I mean, it makes total sense. It's just kind of weird. But it's the backing of the quilt and then the batting and then your quilt top on the top. And as I mentioned in the last video, you need your backing to be 3 to 4 inches wider than your quilt top on every side, and same for the batting. And the reason for that is when we get ready to quilt, the motion of quilting will push that quilt top flat out, and you just want to have extra in case if you had it right on the money and it crawled a little bit, now your quilt top is past where your backing and your batting are. For the record, I will say binding rather than batting. I don't know what it is. My mouth wants to say binding, not batting. I have my backing laid out on the floor. It also does not have to be perfectly square because it is going to get trimmed after we quilt it. So if you don't have it exactly squared up, that is okay. It does not have to be perfect. If you have pieced your back and you have lines that you want to be straight, you will need to orient yourself that way when we put the quilt top down. So first step is to lay this out, and we want to make sure there are no big pieces of thread, especially dark threads and or lint or dirt or crumbs. So P.S. don't ever eat chocolate while you're quilting. Don't ask me how I know that. All right, so so you may want to get a lint roller or a lint brush, just kind of hit it, hit the high spots. Because from this point on, whatever is on your backing fabric and between your quilt top and your batting can potentially show through. So if you haven't taken some time, you may want to pause the video, get your quilt top out and turn it over to where the threads are, where all the seams are, and particularly any dark threads that are loose or pulling away from the seams, you want to trim that off. When I iron my quilt top, a lot of times while it's laid out on the ironing board, I'll just take my little snips and I'll go through and trim off all of those loose threads. Actually, of course, I see some now that I missed. But what can potentially happen if you don't trim particularly the dark threads, if they get loose in this process and then get behind one of those white squares, once you get it all pinned together and start quilting it, you can potentially see that through. And there's really not much to be done about it at that point. And now we have our backing laid out on the floor. Our goal is to make this whole process, each layer, as flat as possible. It does not have to be taut, like you don't want it pulling, but you want it flat. And the purpose of that is when you go to quilt it from here forward, if it's nice and flat, you won't get those puckers and waves of fabric that make it not smooth and pretty. And some of that will literally come out in the wash when it does the crinkly thing that's so great, but you want to start with as smooth as possible. So I have my backing laid out on the floor. It is almost as flat as I can get it. But I'm going to tape down. I'm going to start with the corners. If you have sewn before and ever done any sort of upholstery project, it's kind of the same concept. You start with one corner, like if you've ever recovered chairs and you pull it under and use your staple gun, pow, and then you go to the opposite side and then pow. Same general idea, except without the pow. Okay, so I'm going to go around and I'm going to go to the opposite diagonal and I'm going to pull it just enough where it's flat but not taut. Okay, so I did the two opposing corners and it's still pretty wrinkly. So now I'm going to go to the other two corners. So I'm going to do this one near me. There is a lot of smoothing that happens in this step, a lot. And you can see, if you watch my other videos and you've watched me, is it obsessively or compulsively? Obsessively picks or I'm compelled, it's compulsive. I'm compulsively picking. You can see why, because this is one of those steps where you see all the things and you need to smooth. And so now I've done this corner, I'm gonna go to that opposing corner and pull it just a little bit to make it flat. So I've done my corners and I still see some ripples and bumps. So now I'm gonna do my sides, starting with the one directly in front of me. This sheet, my backing, may actually be a little stretched or warped. And sometimes that happens, or if you iron your fabric and you do the thing that a lot of us do kind of habitually, but it's not great, which is drag the iron across it, you can kind of get those places that get a little stretched out. A little bit of give is okay. It does not have to be perfect. I have to tell myself that all the time about quilting. Okay, now I'm gonna go across to the other side. So I've done this side near me. Now I'm gonna go to the other side. All right, so I've done the two opposing, so right in front of me and then across from me. Now I'm gonna do the other side. So I've got my four corners and my four sides. I'm seeing a little bit of ripples here and there, so I'm just gonna kind of spot tape the areas that I feel like need just a little bit of, not really pulling as much, just as holding. And then once I do that, then we'll put down our batting. So I have my backing taped down, and remember, your tape can go into the backing by like 3 or 4 inches because you've got extra. You may notice on mine, I have some of the pieces of tape are going pretty far into the backing. That's okay. And we'll pull it off when this is done. So now I'm ready to lay my batting, I almost said binding, batting on top. I'm using 100% cotton batting. Now, I did not come up with this term, but when you have extra batting left over, you can actually sew it to other pieces of batting. So we call this Franken batting. So my piece of batting, you probably won't even be able to tell, but is actually pieced together. There's a big seam, but I pieced it together and stitched it in such a way that it's a flat seam. Now, you'll notice once I get this spread out, it's not exactly the same size as my backing. It's pretty close. Doesn't really have any impact on the final quilt, but we do want this to be nice and flat and smooth, just like the backing. So I'm gonna take a second, and by a second, I mean 5 minutes, and smooth it and flatten it and pull off any dark pieces of lint. So here we go. Ooh. Okay, so now I have my batting spread out. It's nice and smooth. I have picked off, of course, any of the dark pieces of thread or lint or whatever that it may have picked up, which in our house, pretty much everybody has threads on their clothes now, because I just do this in like every room and there's thread everywhere. I've said this in other videos, but sometimes my husband will say I'm like the pig pen of threads because we'll have threads everywhere. So I picked that off. You do not have to tape this part down. I don't know if you've ever seen people's quilt design walls, and it's like a flannel or fleecy. The nap of the batting kind of very subtly grabs the cotton underneath, and it just kind of holds it in place. So I can smooth and it will move, but then otherwise it really stays put, which is great. My batting is not exactly to the edges of my backing, and that's okay. Cutting batting, if you use scissors, you're gonna have these jaggedy edges, just kind of janky, and that's fine. You can use your rotary cutter. So if you have a cutting mat, when you're cutting your batting, you can put your mat on the floor and use a ruler and cut your binding, and then scoot your mat and cut some more and scoot your mat, and you'll have a cleaner edge. Even if it's not straight, it'll be a little cleaner. Now is the time that you want to line your quilt top up. So for example, if this piece of tape and this piece of tape were straight, you would use some place on your quilt top to make sure that that's lined up. And sometimes you might want it to be straight and it's not exactly, but honestly, it will be very, very hard to tell in the final result. So I have just kind of fluffed my quilt top because of that nap of the batting. It's kind of grabby, actually. You can see, like, as I'm pushing, it's not really sliding the fabric. So what I'm doing right now at the row in front of me is just kind of making sure it's straight, because it is a little grabby, and it would be, if it gets where the rows are not straight significantly and I don't pull it and smooth it out, then that's what it will look like in the final quilt. I'm gonna do the thing where I go all the way around and smooth and get my exercise for the day and come back breathless. So I'm gonna do that now, and that's what you'll do. So that took a little hot minute for a couple of reasons. So the fabrics that I chose for my quilt, my version of this quilt, the medium blues are actually very lightweight fabrics. And so in the smoothing process, this motion right here, because they're so thin, it can actually distort the row so that they're not square. So, one of the squares might have like a bend like this. Be aware of that when you're smoothing and laying out. Again, you don't want to pull or tug too much, especially if you have very soft, very thin fabric. So you don't want to push down and smooth. You're just smoothing gently. And actually, a couple of times we had to fold it back and put it back. As you're feeling, you want to make sure the seams are lying flat and also lying in the direction that they were pressed. This is one of those times where you can see it and feel it. Now we're going to get into the actual pinning. I have my pins, and I generally just go and pour them out in a pile. I don't know why. It's so not necessary. I really could just go get another pin bowl and use it neatly, but instead I just pour them out so that they're right there where I don't have to feel for them. No one told me to do this, but I start from the middle and work out. Like if there's any tugging, then the center of the quilt stays fairly true. And if things get a little off, it's a little off on the edges, as opposed to starting from one to the other, and then you might get things kind of wonky. And there are a variety of suggestions for how far apart to put your pins. Generally speaking, the more pins that you put in your quilt top or in your quilt sandwich, the less likely you will get those pulls when you do the quilting. As you quilt, it's pulling the backing and the batting and the quilt top together. If your quilt sandwich is very well anchored with lots of pins, that's less likely to happen because the pins hold it in place. I think the recommendation that I've heard most often is 3 to 4 fingers apart. So as I'm pinning, I'm going to start in this dark square right here in the center. And you just push straight down, and I kind of wiggle mine just to make sure I've gotten down to the bottom. And then you pull back through. This is when the curves really work in your favor. At the very most basic, you could do one of these in each and every square, which is the 81 pins. If you do 4 fingers apart, that's actually pretty close to the center. I read somewhere that if you put your hand down anywhere on the whole quilt sandwich, you should feel 2 pins. And I really like that. Now, my hand I have skinny fingers, but I have a surprisingly large hand. I don't know. If you have an itty bitty hand, you may end up with a lot more pins in your quilt sandwich. I will turn my pins every which way just to get it held in different ways. And then this is where having Moana, I have a very large TV right there, and I'll turn on Moana and I'll sing and laugh at the rock. And sometimes I do Tangled, and I'll sing and laugh at whatever her name is, Mamie Moore. And the next thing I know, the whole quilt sandwich is done. So we have finished our quilt sandwich. It's all pin basted and ready to go. I'm gonna pull it up from the floor, pull my tape off, and get ready for the next step, which is quilting. For the next video, you will need a walking foot, and not the ones that are attached to your body. It's a presser foot that is made to hold the layers of your quilt sandwich and pull it together through the machine at the same rate. So you can Google your machine with the model number and walking foot, and it will show you what you need. You can order that on Amazon. A lot of the local quilt fabric stores and the big box stores will have them. But you'll need a walking foot before next time. You're gonna need to have your sewing needles for your machine. And again, the 9014 is excellent for the quilting portion. You're also gonna need 50 weight, 100% cotton thread. And you need to decide on a color for your thread. So I'm gonna use white on the top and maybe like a very light gray, a dove gray for the back, or I may do white and white. Totally up to you. Just remember that your thread on the top is gonna show all the way across the whole surface of your quilt. So if you have a very dark pieces, and use a white thread, it's going to stand out very much. So if you don't want it to stand out a lot, you might go for a neutral, like a tan or a light gray, which just blends a little bit better into the quilt. So those are the things you're gonna need for next time. And to all of you who are new quilters or experienced sewists and you're quilting for the first time, I hope you're enjoying the process. I hope it's coming together for you well. I believe in you. It's going to be fun. We're almost done. Well, not really, but we're getting there. So anyway, I'm Kathy Martin, and this is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.